back to The Main Thread, where we discuss the journey from senior engineer to staff engineer. So, what is a staff engineer anyway? What even is the job description? In this episode, we're joined by Abhishek Mistry, engineering leader at Hudson River Trading, to discuss exactly that. What is this job that ICs aspire to? How is it different from management? How do you influence and lead people when you actually have no real authority? Is it better to go broad or to go deep? How does a staff engineer scale their impact and provide, like Tom Brady, tremendous value above replacement? Abhishek has been in the industry for many years. He has tons of insight, and he's genuinely a very fun guy to talk to. I hope you enjoy the episode. Let's get into it. Welcome back to The Main Thread, everybody. I am your host, Brian Ogilvy, along with my co-host,
Alex Geiser.
And we are joined today by Abhishek Mistry. I just have to go on record and say that that is one of the coolest names ever to have been coined. Abhishek and I have been friends for a number of years since our kids were in preschool together. I'm excited to have him on the podcast today. Abhishek, do you want to give us a little just rundown of who you are, where you came from, all of that stuff?
Sure, and thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me on. So my name's Abhishek. I have like kind of a little bit non-traditional background. I guess that's maybe a theme for this podcast, the host here and myself. But no, I started my career at JP Morgan, and I was a research analyst working in finance. I was, like in a role that was somewhat technical, but it wasn't actually a software role. It was a little bit more of a data sciencey kind of role. But I had a computer science background, and at the same time, I kind of had a little bit of a side hustle, building software and selling DJ software, which is kind of a
Pretty cool.
interesting side gig. And yeah, after 8 years of that, I was kind of, I wanted to do something in the tech space. I really wanted to like try to start my own business, and so I left that job and did my own like little tech startup for a couple of years. Made a software product that still sells today, actually. And that was a fun gig. It was an interesting gig. I worked a lot, learned a lot of different technologies. As you know, like you work on a startup, that's kind of like what you do. And I did that for a couple of years. I had a great time with it. And then it was time to move on. And then I got into kind of like merged my interests and got into automated trading. So the last 6 years, call it, I've been working in automated trading. I was at Two Sigma, which is a quantitative hedge fund, for 3 years. And I worked on a team that traded sort of retail order flow, and then moved over to a company called Hudson River Trading 3 years ago, and I've been at HRT since. The first couple of years at HRT, I was an IC, and so I built a lot of data infrastructure and worked on a lot of tooling and backtesting tools and other sorts of projects for a mid-frequency trading strategy. And then I moved over to leading a team. Now I think we're 9 people, and this team basically builds kind of like UIs for trading purposes. So some of it's for kind of monitoring our existing automated trading. Some of it's for kind of manual or semi-systematic strategies where humans, need to be in the process because of various reasons, like maybe the market's not fully automated or something like that. And then there's, some other sort of tooling for sort of research purposes, like you can view jobs that you've submitted in our, sort of distributed research environment and understand kind of what's going on. Are there any actions you need to take? Did you make a bug somewhere and you need to take a look at it? Provides a lot of like visibility. I think the thing that our team does that's a little bit different from other teams is that we usually have some web component to our software. So a lot of people build various command line tools and processes that run, and it's all like, like there's a lot of low latency C++ and things like that. I think for us, we have a lot of back end tooling, but the front end is a website. So that's where it's a little bit different. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Awesome, man. Thanks for that. That's great. Yeah, cool. Like we are definitely a non-traditional background group here today. So this is great. Those who don't remember, Alex and I were both like coding boot camp grads before we got into our careers and had wholly different lives beforehand.
We've worked on some cool things, but I don't think we've got cool DJ software, cool projects under our belts. So that's pretty great.
I know. I've never done DJ software. I've actually had the pleasure of being at a bar where your photo sharing app was deployed, and it was really cool. It really enhanced the whole experience. It was great. So we talk about this podcast a lot about trying to grow to staff engineer, trying to have impact as a staff engineer, but we wanted to kind of take a step back and just define what even is a staff engineer. It seemed like that was a topic that you were excited to talk about, Abhishek. So I just love to kick that right over to you and say, in your quick definition, like what would you say? What is a staff engineer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because I feel like I struggled with like understanding this question and the answer for many years. I think like what the way I think about it is like, okay, what's a senior engineer? I think a senior engineer is someone who you can give a project and they will sort of make it happen, right? Maybe it's, they scope it out, plan out, the JIRAs or like, sort of milestones, things like that. They may lead junior engineers in this effort, delegate parts of it, talk to stakeholders, etc. But it's all sort of like a project that they're sort of given and then they sort of run with it, right? I think a staff engineer to me is sort of like it's a step beyond that. It's kind of like I think of it in terms of like in sports, people talk about like value above replacement, right? Like you get like Tom Brady is an amazing quarterback, and then like you take your average quarterback and you just replace him with Tom Brady, then you go win the Super Bowl, right? Like that's kind of like we've done this experiment, we've seen that's true,
It's
right?
that easy.
So
I mean,
so
almost.
like so clearly Tom Brady has like tremendous value above replacement. And so like when I think about staff engineer, it's sort of like, is this person delivering much more value than just, some other senior engineer that I could hire from, Meta or, someplace like that, right? So that's kind of like what I think is a staff engineer is like someone who's adding a lot of value.
So I want to dig into a little bit more on that providing more value, because I think one of the mistakes that a lot of juniors make as they're looking to grow their careers and reach sort of beyond that senior level is when you're a junior, you're mostly blocked by your ability to learn and execute in certain technology, whatever it is that you're doing at your company. And the more efficient you become at using that technology, the more productive you are. You ship more code, you learn better design patterns, et cetera, you get more done. But there's a ceiling on that, right? Like you're going to get promoted to a senior engineer, usually by the strength of your technical abilities. And at a certain point, you've maxed out how productive you as an individual can be. And in order to provide more value, you can't just simply work longer hours or write more code, right? Like that is diminishing returns at this point. So the kind of value you're talking about, what do you see that as?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for different people too, right? Like some people are really deep technically and they understand nuances of, maybe it's, you're working on embedded systems and you really understand memory layouts and CPU instructions like better than your peers and you can solve a technical problem that other people can't solve. Right? And that's one way to kind of be that sort of staff engineer. It's like, other people are struggling with something and you like jump in and you figure it out pretty quickly. It's one way. It's often a difficult way because that takes sort of like years and years and years of expertise and maybe a lot of people don't get there. Another way is some people are just like really good at being broad, understanding across an organization or a company or multiple teams or something, like kind of how things fit together, right? So like that breadth and understanding of like all these different parts helps them to then navigate and come up with like really awesome things that other people might not have done, right? This might be like, I'm building some new tooling. Like I did this recently where, my team had sort of like a bunch of different log files in different places and it was super messy and it was oftentimes hard to find out where errors were. Like it's like, oh, this thing broke, I don't even know where to look for the errors, right? So let's clean this up. Like I want to build some tooling to clean this up, right? And so but rather than just working on cleaning up that logging for my team, then I went and talked to some other teams that were having similar problems and understood their needs and like how some of their needs might be a little bit different than our needs, right? But then like maybe we can build some common tooling that'll work across multiple teams and everyone benefits. I mean, obviously our team will benefit and we'll sort of accomplish that goal, but then other teams will. And in order to do something like that, you have to understand a little bit of what people are doing and like how everything sort of ties in and fits together, and that can be pretty hard to do. There's different ways. Like I said, sort of like two ways I immediately thought of is like going really deep or going really broad.
Yeah, we talked about this before. It seems like a lot of times, like your typical tech lead has to usually be very broad in their knowledge and maybe get very, very deep in a couple of strata, right? But have a pretty decent understanding of a lot of things and a very deep understanding of a few things.
So that actually begs a question that I think is a very distinctly different thing between a senior engineer and a staff engineer, because one thing that really seems to be much more important is something like institutional knowledge and organizational knowledge at the staff level. Whereas it seems like in order to solve that sort of question, you need to really have a deep and broad understanding of the organization that you were working in itself, rather than whereas if you're working as a senior engineer, you may only be working on one part, and you can actually move between companies or between teams more easily because the specific technologies that you're working with are, less important than like the specific problem that you're working on. Whereas from what you're describing, you need to understand like the broad strokes of the organization itself. And I don't know, it's just something that I'm curious if that's what you found. And as somebody who wants to move on to that level, how do you cultivate that sort of knowledge?
Absolutely. I think yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you're 100% right there. This is where, like, a lot of times people sort of make the comment that engineers only stick around for like 2 to 3 years at a particular job, or like, it's sort
Mm-hmm.
of like after a couple of years, it's time to move on. And I think, like, if you're an early career engineer, like that's a pretty reasonable strategy. You get exposed to a lot of different things. You see things at different companies. You understand what your preferences are, and then sort of like where you shine, and that kind of helps you. But at a certain point, it is a little bit detrimental to sort of jump around like that, because I think what we're kind of getting at here is you have to do really impactful work. And in order to do really impactful work, you need to understand a lot about your organization or your company, or just different moving parts. And it's hard to do that if you're jumping around a lot. I think one way that you can kind of show impact that without having a ton of organizational context is having context on similar problems, right? So like if you've like, I don't know, you built Google search, and then like Microsoft hires you to work on Bing, there's probably a lot of knowledge that you have that you can apply. I mean, obviously you have like IP considerations and stuff like that, but like still, like there's a lot of techniques and things like that you can sort of bring to the table. Like so that's one way you can kind of bridge that. But I think it's a little bit harder. It's definitely a little bit harder. And so like coming in at like this is why companies are a little bit reluctant to hire people at high levels, because it's just like there's so much organizational knowledge that makes it easier to have like a ton of impact. So yes, absolutely. I think building up that context to take on those impactful projects and become a staff engineer, like that's sort of a little bit of a requirement there.
And to follow up on your example with moving from search from like Google search to like Bing or something like that, maybe you can solve the technical problem. But and it kind of maybe is jumping ahead a little bit, but it seems like a lot of the skills are not technical skills; they're organizational skills and people skills, and those don't necessarily transfer over if you're really good at getting something done at Google. But if you go over to Microsoft, understanding the levers that you need to pull in order to get something done may not translate, and it may be, even though you might be the best in the world at getting a search engine put together, you might suffer compared to somebody who just knows who to talk to. you know
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're not even just knowing who to talk to, but like having relationships with those people, right? Like, I mean, there's so much that I've gotten done in my career just because, like, hey, like, it's like, hey, this guy, like, it's somebody that you've talked to, you've maybe worked on projects with, or at least gone out to lunch with, and such. Like, I don't know. There is an aspect of things that, like, we're all humans. Like, I think we sort of like we live in code, and like live and breathe these, like, sort of autonomous, like, automated things, right? But at the same time, like, people are people. If you're asking somebody to sort of go along with some design, or you're asking for feedback on some tool that you built, and the person's like super busy, like it's not really like it's not really the thing that they're like personally interested in at that point, or like maybe they got some deadline to work on or whatever, right? And if you have a relationship with that person, then it's a totally different conversation. Then they're much more open to kind of helping you out, and maybe they take like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever, take a look at whatever you're doing, and get back to you. And that's the kind of thing that, like, you need to build those relationships.
And those relationships take time to build. It's very hard to come in at a very senior level and work at that in that scope with that many relationships required when you haven't had time to build them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this where like, somebody came in, and was like, top dog at this other firm, and like, they come in, they have some idea, and they're like, oh, we should do this, this, and this, and people are like, no, like, they're sort of
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
they're like, like, who are you? Like, why like, who's this person dictating like how we should do things? Like, no,
Right.
that's, like, we're not doing this.
Yeah. I want to really come back to that exact subject in a minute because it's about like how you have influence as an engineer versus as an executive. But one thing I want to do first is I feel like we talk a lot about the differences between staff is like when you're growing to a senior level, it's very much about scaling yourself,
Yeah.
scaling your abilities. But when you're getting to that staff level, it's largely about scaling through others, right? These relationships that we've been talking about using a large network of a lot of different people to get something very complex done. And in some ways, it seems like the job of being an effective staff engineer is fundamentally different from what the job is of being a successful junior or senior engineer. And I wonder sometimes, like, are the skill sets that you build as you work from junior to senior level, all of those skills that you work on and develop, are those still valid and useful at the staff level? Or do you have to learn a fundamentally different group of skills in order to operate effectively at that next level?
I mean, I would say they're still necessary. You still have to be able to write code. You still have to be able to find bugs and things like that. I just think that like the job becomes a lot more than that, right? So it's a whole different set of skills that you need on top of that. And you're going to be writing code. If you're a staff engineer, like you are expected to write code most places, but the code you're going to be writing is probably more technically demanding than what other people are doing, or maybe it's relatively simple stuff, but at the same time, like you don't have a lot of time. Like your time is being spent on so many different things, and if you want to put out this diff, it better be something that you can do relatively quickly. And that's where those skills come in handy. Is that like you've done this so much, you have like a certain mastery over the process of architecting code, testing it, going through code reviews, all that stuff, that you can then spend less time on that, and it frees up more time for you to scope out some important idea or get feedback on something, or like just different things that you'll need to do that are outside of just writing code.
Yeah, it seems like these days, most of the code that I write tends to be, as you mentioned, on something that's pretty complex, that it's not just straight out of the box, like, oh, I'm gonna just make this React component or this API call or build this simple server, right? It's like you've got a product that's running and you've discovered now that you've scaled beyond your query or your rate limit, that kind of thing, and you need to sort of re-architect how you batch things or pre-aggregate data, that kind of stuff. And it takes time to sit and think and explore a couple of ideas. And by the time you really get around to writing code, it may not be that much code, but it's the right code, and it solves a very complex problem. I've noticed that definitely, like, my lines of code like go down when I'm working on problems like that, even though it may be as impactful or probably more impactful as the code I was writing before, when it was just like, you've got a task, pull down the task. There's a very well-defined path in order to accomplish it, get it done, put it up for review, land it, move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the most impactful work. I was talking to one of the other engineers at HRT about this. The idea of like a request for comment. This is something that some companies are really really good at. Some companies take to the extreme, and then some companies don't really do much of. I think like a lot of times, like the value, like the most impactful thing you can do is just create an RFC, right? Like it's not even the code. Like none of the code is actually all that complicated or important, but it's the act of putting together all the thoughts, collecting feedback from people, and coming up with a good design and building that document. That's the hard part, right? And that's the part that's like really impactful and valuable. And then anyone can just sort of take that and sort of run with it.
Yeah, so a lot of what I've been working on lately has been building out a fundamental source of truth query layer that brings together data from a lot of different systems that have very few, if any, standards between them. And in order to build that out, I need to fundamentally understand the needs of my consumers, right? The people who need to query this, which is the phone management, privacy, security people, versus the people who are actually the SMEs in these different systems that I'm trying to aggregate data from. I can't be a subject matter expert on every possible system that Meta has running, right? So much of it is like you said, these RFCs where I'm going to write down what I think is probably a good architecture of how I'm going to get data out of one system and what I think is the important data to get out, how I'm going to normalize it so that the rest of the world can consume it. And then I send it out to the people who really know, and they say, well, yeah, what you think is a unique identifier in this system actually isn't because of XYZ. You need to think about this other thing, right? And that's the only way to actually come to the right solution is by engaging all of these different folks who really know how different systems work. And that does become a much larger part of my job now is just getting that alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. Alignment. I love that you said that word. Like I think that's such a like key part that people often miss. I mean, I don't know how it is with you, Brian, but like I definitely feel like there were points in my past where I worked on things that I thought were important, but management didn't sort of like see them as important. And like that was such a common pitfall. And I think that's like a key differentiator of staff engineers is that issue of alignment.
I think we've all experienced that from time to time.
Yeah, and or I think something is really important because it feels that way viscerally to me. And I work on a solution, and people are like, "Great, nice." And then when it comes time for performance review, I'm trying to talk about the impact of what all the work I did, and I look at that thing and I go, like I enjoyed working on that, but I don't think it had the broad impact that I imagined it would. And I probably should have worked to align what I was going to work on with not just my own manager, but his skip, my director, like making sure that what I was working on was what they feel is impactful. And then, putting metrics in place beforehand to verify whether or not it's having the impact I thought it would.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and it's definitely something that I've missed in the past. And I think it's great to have ideas and be able to like proactively find things, and that's part of the staff being a staff engineer. But you can't just like work on things that you think are worthwhile. It's really like what is management value, and sometimes that's not going to be the same thing, and you might think like, oh, these guys are clowns, like management's full of idiots or whatever, and oftentimes, that there is some truth to that, but like a lot of times that's not the case. It's just that like management has a different perspective of, all the different projects that are going on.
Different incentives.
And maybe like the thing that you're interested in is actually important and impactful. It's just not the most important and impactful thing in that org at that point in time. It might be something that right now I kind of want, people to work on this XYZ other thing, and then we'll come back to your thing in maybe 6 months or a year or whatever. And that's something that like everyone should be kind of like just be humble about it and kind of like take that perspective. Like you can come up with ideas, you can find evidence, and I'm a big fan of prototyping and finding data and things like that. Like I think these are things that don't take that much time. Spend a couple hours like prototyping something, go show people, and go talk to your manager, go talk to their manager. To your point, Brian, like couple levels or so, like and see what people think, and maybe they just say, yeah, this is great, Brian, like go ahead, like we want you to do this right now. But they might also say like, this is cool, but we'll probably look at this at some point in the future. And that's not a knock on you, like that's not a knock on your idea. It's just that there's all these other important things to work on, and ultimately it's a business, right? It's not, we're not doing this because we just like, I mean, hopefully you like what you're doing, and I definitely like what I'm doing, but at the same time, like the point of a company is to then deliver value to customers, and so you can't lose sight of that fact, as we're sort of picking projects and working on things.
Yeah. I've got a project myself that you mentioned, like an infra management project that I am very passionate about, but it's been on ice for a year while I've worked on some other things that are higher priority for the org. And yeah, I mean, that's just kind of life, right? You're hired by a company to increase their revenue or lower their bottom line or whatever it is that your company needs you to do. And alignment with those company priorities is what makes an effective staff engineer. Alex, I saw you mentioned you had a question here that I really want to get into around how is being a staff engineer fundamentally different from being a manager at a similar level. because there's so much overlap between when it comes to coordinating between different pieces. And a good manager certainly does that. But what are the differences between a good staff engineer and a good manager?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely a lot of overlap there, right? Like, I think part of being a staff engineer is having the ability to lead people and set direction and kind of like guide projects. And part of being a manager is also, sort of leading people, guiding projects, setting direction. I think where it's kind of different is that, as a staff engineer, as an IC, you don't have reports. So you're expected to kind of lead people, but you don't have like there's no like set authority there, right? Like when you're in a management role, like the people who report to you, there's a little bit of sort of like a power differential there, right? In that, like, you control probably their compensation and certainly their growth at the company and things like that. Whereas, as an IC staff engineer, that's not going to be the case. So how do you then lead people, right? It's a little bit different skill set even than as a manager in that sense. So there's overlap, but it's also a little bit different. Like, I think the way you lead people as a staff engineer is to kind of convince people that your ideas are the best ideas, and that's where building relationships with people helps. That's where, like, just being good at communication. I think this is something that helped me a lot. Was I took some like classes around influential communication and kind of listening to people and like making sure that they feel heard and building consensus. These are skills that, again, they're not coding, and they're kind of not the sort of thing engineers typically like focus on, to be honest. But it is the thing that's like critical for like operating at that level.
If you have any of those classes that you took that you want to recommend to listeners, we'll definitely we could put links in the show notes. So I'd love to hear about those.
Yeah, I'll try to dig up some URLs and send them over.
Cool.
That actually dovetails with another question that we had, which is, are there any unexpectedly useful skills or experience that you've acquired? Anything that, you wouldn't get from reading a book on being a staff engineer that might be surprising?
I think being a good listener, the ability to listen to people and like understand what they're really asking or what they're really concerned about. And it's that, like, a lot of like empathizing with people and just kind of like seeing where they're at and where they're coming from. This is the kind of thing that like a lot of people do. I mean, some people do this for a living, right? Like your therapists, like they do this for a living. But like for me personally, I don't think that was like something that I had built up. But like to have these sort of like impactful projects and to drive change across the organization or across teams or things like that, you kind of have to spend a lot of time just listening to people. And that's something that, like, I think we could all do better at. And there is a certain skill to, like, when somebody disagrees with you, and you talk to them, and then they like walk away feeling like, okay, like this person sort of heard what I had to say, and I don't think like this person's a jerk or something like that, right? Like that's and maybe you're still gonna like ultimately not gonna do what they would like, but they don't get upset about it, right? And that's the kind of like skill that is pretty useful, and it's like it was something that I found kind of unexpected.
Useful at all levels. That's always going to be helpful throughout your life.
I think you said life, right? Like you're talking to your partner or whatever, right? And like
How to be an effective
I,
staff spouse.
yeah, I think my wife would classify me as a senior spouse, not a staff spouse.
Yeah, right.
That's true. No, I definitely have a director at home that I
That's
answer
right.
to. Well, we're getting towards time. This is a really terrific conversation, and I'm having a great time with this. But I want to give us a chance to kind of talk through if you have any like general recommendations, things you've been reading lately, something that's just helping you that is just something that hasn't been part of the main conversation. Anything you want to throw out there for listeners who might want to check it out? If you want a minute to think, I'll jump in and start. So we started a book club for my org about 6 weeks ago now. And we originally intended it for juniors to learn, but as it turns out, all seniors showed up, which is kind of, I think, telling about where they're at in terms of their kind of interest in growing themselves and learning. But we've just been reading together. And so what I want to pick here is community learning. So we've each week been taking a chapter out of the Pragmatic Programmer, reading it on our own. And then one member of the group will sort of present the chapter when we come together. And it's been really great. I've read the book I don't know how many times at this point over my career, and but hearing other people and getting a chance to discuss it with them is having me look at things in a different way, and I just love this. So if you have a chance to get into a group and sort of go through something and learn it together, I think it is far more effective than when you do this on your own. By the way, I have to shout out to Charles Max Wood from JavaScript Jabber, because reading The Pragmatic Programmer in a book club was totally his idea, which I stole. All right, Alex, you got anything you want to shout out?
I'm rereading Refactoring by Martin Fowler. It's always a good book. It's always got something new to add every single time I read it. It always gives me a lot of useful insight. And then I'm also reading Functional Programming Simplified by Alvin Alexander. It's a Scala book, and I've got it with me. It's got the coolest cover because it's got a lambda, and it's attacking an entire crowd of people, because functional programming can be scary, but not when you read this book. It's a good book. It's a good intro.
I assume all those people are Java OOP developers?
They're all Java OOP developers. They wouldn't know a functor if it, came up and gave a big wet kiss. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I mean, like what, I don't know how to follow that.
You're like, well, that was weird.
Functional programming is great. I actually TA'd for a functional programming class back in college. It's fun stuff. One thing like actually topical that I thought was interesting is there's a book called The Staff Engineer's Path. I don't know if you guys have read it, but that's something I would recommend.
I haven't read
It's
that one.
yeah, it's sort of a collection of anecdotes of various people who sort of like chronicled like some of the things they found useful or influential, or kind of their journey. And I would recommend taking a look at that book. Yeah, I think I read it a couple of years ago, and it was great.
That's awesome. I'll check it out. I'll put a link in the show notes as well.
Otherwise, I spend a lot of time just like reading white papers of different things or documentation, and trying to understand this framework versus that framework, and like where what we should be using, and what are the pros and cons of like using whatever the latest shiniest thing is versus like something tried and true like Tornado or whatever, right? Like I don't know, like that's fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of my time is just like figuring out like what technologies are out there, and there's just so many different things.
Yeah, I love getting a chance to explore new languages that I don't usually work in, because sometimes like the conventions that they set up in that language are usually because they were trying to solve some very specific problem that other languages failed these creators in, and learning about that process, whether I ever end up using that language or not in production, it's kind of nice to just sort of learn why they felt it was necessary to create it, and maybe I learned some paradigms that I can bring back into my daily work.
Where do you find these white papers?
Just go to different projects. I mean,
Okay.
like whatever it is you're looking at, like let's say you're looking at, we were talking about logging libraries earlier. Like, I don't know, you could look at things that are out there like Elasticsearch, or, or Sentry, or I don't know, just different logging, and metrics and collection tools, see how they're implemented. Like, I think I remember like a couple of years ago, I was looking into something that's kind of, I feel like it's dead now, like these NoSQL databases. And I was trying to understand like, I don't know. Maybe dead's the wrong word, but it's definitely like it was hot for a while, and then now it's probably like
They're dead to me. I'll say that much.
So I was trying to understand it. Like I read like a bunch of white papers that Cassandra put out, or MongoDB, and like understand like why they're doing things a certain way, or like what technical challenges they're trying to solve, or like that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about.
Cool.
Yeah, if you're not seeing the video, you missed an epic eye roll from Alex, which is really unfortunate, because this is a conversation we've had a bunch in the past around. I'm just like, I don't like document databases; they're not my thing. Like, I just give me a SQL table, I'm super happy. And the argument is like, it doesn't scale. I'm like, well, Facebook is pretty big. We're based in SQL, so. Like, but yeah, it's funny. I just think like,
like IBM's been making SQL databases for like 50 years, and they're used in like all these different banks and stuff like that, doing like millions of transactions a day, right? Like it's possible to do these things.
But that's boring.
Yeah, it can't scale.
Yeah, like that's a very boring thing.
No, but I think
venture funding, right? Like you build a SQL database, that doesn't get you venture funding.
Exactly. That's right. Everybody does SQL, but have you heard about like anti-SQL? You have to use the opposite schema. It's great. It scales inversely. It's wonderful.
The paradigm there is no normalization whatsoever.
That's right. It's great.
So yeah, listen, I think we've ragged on MongoDB enough, and in all honesty, like, every technology that's out there, it exists because it solves a particular problem, right? And so, again, like, not to belabor my own preferences, right? That's all they are. They're my preferences. So every technology has worth and has validity. It's just a matter of like how you want to solve your problems.
Oh, I should mention that my views are, the views expressed here are my own and not those of my company, Hudson River Trading. I feel obligated to say that.
Yeah, thank you for being the adult in the room and reminding us that that is always true. We are here as individuals. So yeah, we're right at time here. So I think we should just go ahead and call it here. But Abhishek, I want to say thank you so much for your time. This is really terrific, explaining your perspective on what makes a staff engineer at all. So again, thanks for coming. You're welcome back anytime.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks a lot, Brian and Alex. I had a pleasure coming on here. This is a great time.
And for everyone listening, we will catch you next time.